Thank you, David. It's been an honor to work with the Institute of Politics this year. So, Sally Yates, she left the Justice Department in the same way that she began her career in public service. As a trailblazer, equipped with American values and a deep understanding of the rule of law, who was not afraid to say no to hard cases. The first 20 years of Ms. Yates' career began as an attorney in Georgia, where she eventually became the first woman to hold the position as U.S. Attorney in the Northern District of Georgia. During this time, Ms. Yates prosecuted cases that were focused on public corruption and fraud. And she also prosecuted the case of Eric Rudolph, the man who committed the Centennial Olympic Park bombings. It was in 2015 that Ms. Yates was confirmed as the Deputy Attorney General of the United States after being nominated by President Barack Obama. In her capacity as Deputy AG, Ms. Yates was able to spearhead changes on criminal justice reform and was able to author the Yates Memo, which prioritized prosecuting executives and corporate crime. It was in January 2017 that Sally Yates would make a decision that would alter her career and elevate her into the national spotlight. Ms. Yates acted as she swore to do when she took office, as a public servant to the people with the duty to uphold the Constitution. She refused to defend Executive Order 13769, a travel ban on refugees and immigrants from 7 Muslim-majority countries. It was this decision that led to her removal as acting Attorney General, but looking back, she has said that she wouldn't have done anything differently. In a call to action op-ed published in USA Today, Ms. Yates wrote, "We are not living in ordinary times, and it is not enough for us to admire our nation's core values from afar." Sally Yates answered her call to action for the country, and she believes now is the time for all Americans to do the same. Moderating this discussion today is Carrie Johnson. She's currently the NPR Justice Correspondent, who is an award-winning journalist who previously worked at the Washington Post. She's covered the FBI and Justice Department and has focused on major challenges such as the national voting rights law to the Obama administration's drone program. Please join me in welcoming former Attorney General Sally Yates and NPR Justice Correspondent Carrie Johnson to the stage.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for the warm introduction, and delighted to hear you're going to be going into public service and helping to make government work. Ms. Yates, you recently hosted a conference devoted to the Trump administration's relentless attack on democratic institutions and norms, and you said our democracy could be in the balance. That sounds really serious. What do you mean?
Wow, we're starting with a downer here, aren't we? Right. Okay. Well, okay, I'll get to that. But first, let me also thank Jennifer. What an incredibly generous introduction. Thank you for that. And enjoyed also meeting with Jennifer and some of the other students here this afternoon before being able to be here with all of you. And thank you, David, and all the folks at IOP for the chance to be with you this evening. Well, democracy is in the balance, I think, to the extent that we want to think about our democracy as we know it today. You know, this was a convening, a gathering we had of people from both sides of the aisle. Because when you talk about the rule of law and you talk about independent courts and a free press, those aren't bipartisan issues. Those are really nonpartisan issues. Those are really the core values of our country. And I think values that all of us have an obligation to actively defend. And so that was the purpose of this convening, was to address the rule of law and how it's operated in the past, and particularly with respect to the independence of the Justice Department, how it's operating now, and why the difference matters there, what kind of impact it can have, and why independent courts are so important, and why a free press is absolutely essential to our democracy as well. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that our democracy is going down the tubes tomorrow. It's not. I think our institutions are strong and resilient, and I think people care about those institutions, but they're not self-perpetuating. They really require all of us to actively engage. We've said, democracy is not a spectator sport. We really all have to be engaged in one way or another. And that was the purpose of that convening, was to bring people together from both sides of the aisle to talk about those things that unite us.
Let's talk first about the rule of law. You devoted something like 27, 28 years of your professional life to the Department of Justice. Republicans and Democrats in Washington seem to agree, at least most, that the Department of Justice and the FBI have actually been under siege from the White House almost since Inauguration Day, if not before. Just this morning, the president helpfully tweeted, 13 angry Democrats in charge of the Russian witch hunt are starting to find out there's a court system in place that actually protects people from justice. The president also smeared by name some FBI officials who recently left. What does that mean to the people still working in those institutions and for the functioning of the justice system?
Well, it's really hard for the people that are at DOJ to have really this daily onslaught. And you know, the thing is, we were talking earlier, when this kind of stuff started, you know, it would be reported as, in an unprecedented step, the president has done X. You know, now I wonder if those tweets will even make it to the evening news, since they were this morning, because we've moved on to something else. And, you know, it's really essential that we not move on to something else. That this basic concept of the rule of law, the idea that our laws are supposed to apply equally to everyone, that no one's above the law, and that the law is not used by the executive as a sword to go after one's enemies or a shield to protect one's friends. You know, that's the basic core foundational stuff of our country. And not only has those rules and norms been violated every day, they're the personal attacks on people at DOJ. And I worry about that for a whole lot of reasons, that I guess we'll get into some of those, but it's not just that it hurts the morale of the people at the Department of Justice, but it does that as well. It's that I believe it really damages the public's confidence in the criminal justice system and how it's used. And when this stuff happens so frequently, I think people start to believe it's normal for the President of the United States to tell the Justice Department whom they should be prosecuting or who they shouldn't. Let me tell you, it is not normal. And I actually believe that it's dangerous.
Well, when you talk about the impact on public confidence, this could play a role in all sorts of cases the Justice Department and the FBI try to bring. You have a background in prosecuting domestic terrorists, corrupt public officials. You get these kinds of sentiments on the jury, and we could have a very interesting result there.
Sure, look, I'm not going to pretend to you that DOJ is perfect or the FBI is perfect. It's clearly not. And there have been missteps and people have done things along the way that shouldn't have happened. But I believe that those are the exception rather than the rule. And when then they are used and the Department of Justice and FBI are bludgeoned almost daily with this, I think it does undermine people's confidence in the fairness of the system, which is a bad thing even if they're not sitting on a jury. I mean, it's important for who we are as a country to believe in the overall fairness of our criminal justice system. We have work to do in that in a whole lot of areas, but believe in the overall fairness. And then when you do have a situation where you have people on a jury, or God forbid we have another 9/11 type incident, and FBI agents have to go and talk to people to try to get information, and there's not the trust there that needs to exist to be able to do that investigation, that has a real impact on the safety of our country. And also, I just got to give a shout out to my former colleagues at FBI and DOJ. Let me tell you, these are really hardworking, earnest people that are trying to do the right thing. Now, none of us may necessarily agree with every decision that they make, and that's fair, but these are people who are trying really hard to keep their head down, to keep people safe, to do it in a fair way, and they're not really being treated with the honor and dignity that they deserve.
This weekend, the president's new lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, came out and said he wasn't sure if the president would comply with a subpoena if he got one for his testimony in the Robert Mueller special counsel investigation into Russian interference in the election. As somebody who's represented the Justice Department for a long time, as an American citizen, what goes through your mind when you hear the president might not comply with a subpoena if one is given?
Well, I guess my first reaction is that they shouldn't have to subpoena him. I've heard people on cable news sort of gaming out whether if I represented the president, whether I would advise him that he should sit down with Bob Mueller. And, that really bothers me. I mean, they're gaming it out as if he's just some regular guy and we're talking about an investigation for bank fraud or some other sort of run-of-the-mill kind of crime. I mean, this is the President of the United States. And the issues here about whether or not the Russians conspired with individuals in this country to interfere in our election, that is really important stuff that we need the answers to, whatever those answers are, whether there is evidence of that type of conspiracy or not. We need the answers to those. And it seems to me, if you want to be our president, if you want to be the leader of our country, then there is an obligation, even without a subpoena, to answer those questions.
Since we're here at the Institute of Politics, I thought I'd ask a question about the separation of powers. As you well may know, Congress is not really your problem anymore, but some members of Congress have been leaning on the current Justice Department leadership, both the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General, to turn over all sorts of materials about ongoing investigations, including what appears to be the ongoing Russia investigation, threatening even to try to impeach the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, who's been supervising the Mueller probe, and this week threatening to possibly impeach or lean on Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Where is the balance between those two government entities, the legislative branch and the executive branch through the Justice Department?
Well, it's always a delicate balance there, that certainly Congress has the authority for some level of oversight over the Department of Justice and executive agencies. But there has always been a line when it comes to active investigations and providing specific information about ongoing investigations because of the impact that it can have on those investigations. And, I don't envy the folks at DOJ right now because they're under tremendous pressure to give in to those demands. And on the one hand, you don't want to, say no to something that may not make that much difference. On the other hand, from a precedent-setting standpoint, it can end up making a huge difference because once you go down that road, it's very hard to stop. And, you don't want to be putting information in the hands of people, and I'm not suggesting anybody here would or wouldn't, but, it's separated out the way that it is so that that information isn't used for political purposes, so that it's only used for law enforcement and intelligence purposes and not for political purposes.
You signed your name recently to a letter along with something like 800 other former Justice Department officials insisting that the man supervising the special counsel probe, Rod Rosenstein, at the Justice Department not be fired. Why is that so important to you? I understand you may not agree with all the political and substantive decisions that guy has made over the last year, yet you signed your name to this letter.
Yeah, and that's, and I would point out that of the 800, there were, and I don't know exactly what the, how it divvies up numbers-wise, there were Republicans and Democrats that were former DOJ folks that signed this letter because, there's been a lot of focus on ensuring that Bob Mueller isn't fired. And look, I'm totally with you on that. I agree with that. Bob Mueller should not be fired. But I get a little worried sometimes that people are not focused on what the ramifications could be if Rod Rosenstein is fired. Because as the DAG in this instance, since the AG is recused, means that he has control over the scope of the special counsel's investigation. He has control over the major significant steps that they would take. For example, executing search warrants or returning indictments. He has control over whether information is put in a public report that could go to Congress. And likewise, if there were grounds for this, he would have control over whether articles of impeachment could be presented to Congress for their consideration. So there's a whole lot that the Deputy Attorney General is controlling, and most of that is done, as it should be, behind closed doors, so you never even really necessarily know whether someone has said no to a search or no to going forward with an indictment, et cetera. And so I think we all should be concerned that firing Rod Rosenstein is really just a backdoor way to be able to control the special counsel.
You have taken down corrupt public officials in your home state of Georgia.
I think they took themselves down, but that's all right.
Yeah. And you know that there are norms in place at the Justice Department about taking steps close to an election, taking steps that could influence an election. Does that mean that pretty soon the special counsel is going to have to go underground and go quiet since we're approaching the midterms? It's already May. What does that mean for the special counsel probe as somebody who's been in those shoes before?
Yeah, and these are really policies and practices in place at the department for all levels of elections, whether you're talking about somebody who's running for sheriff or someone who's running for president. The idea is that the Department of Justice doesn't unnecessarily take overt action in an investigation or in a prosecution in the lead up to an election that could reasonably have an impact on that election. Now you have to take into account, obviously, those considerations are most acute when you're talking about taking an action with respect to someone who is running for office. And so, for example, in this instance, where the investigation centers around individuals associated with the president's campaign, and the president is not up for re-election in 2018, that wouldn't be until 2020, it doesn't directly implicate that, but still it's something I think that the department would be, and that the special counsel would be mindful of, that you wouldn't in all likelihood return an indictment, for example, even that didn't involve directly people who were running for office right on the eve of an election. I mean, the idea is you try to keep DOJ out of that.
And try as he might, the former FBI director Bob Mueller keeps getting dragged back into the political arena by partisans on one side or the other. I don't need to tell you there are baseball caps and T-shirts that say it's Mueller time. Every time the guy indicts somebody or unveils an indictment or gets a guilty plea, parts of the internet rejoice. He's a prosecutor. Yeah. He's not a politician.
Yeah, that is, I mean, the idea that there are shirts that say it's Mueller time, if you all knew him, that's just so not him. He is, I have tremendous respect for Bob Mueller. He's not a lot of yucks. He is just the facts ma'am kind of guy who is very focused on his work, is very focused on getting it right, and has always been that way from the time that he was in the Department of Justice as a prosecutor to the time that he was FBI director. I wouldn't have been able to tell you what political affiliation Bob had, because frankly, if the department's working the right way, you really shouldn't be able to tell what political affiliation anybody has, but particularly with Bob. I mean, the idea that he, is in the tank for the Democrats is almost laughable.
So all these people placing their hopes and expectations in this one guy, where should they direct their energies?
Well, I guess a couple of things I would say to that is that what we ought to be hoping for is that the special counsel is able to get to the bottom of this and get answers to the questions as to whether or not President Trump or members of his campaign had conspired with the Russians, regardless of what that answer is. We ought to hope that he is able to determine whether it happened and that there's evidence of that. But equally, we should be willing to accept, if his determination is that it didn't, we should be willing to accept that as well. And what we should hope for is not any particular result, but that he's able to get all the information and evidence that he needs to be able to make that determination.
The former director of national intelligence, Jim Clapper, who has a 40 or a 50-year career in public service across the government, has recently been writing that when people come to him for advice about what to do about taking a job in the government, he says, just don't do it. What's your reaction to that?
I guess it sort of depends on what job you'd be talking about. And look, I get this question a lot, and when I was meeting with the students earlier today, I told them, I've been speaking at a lot of colleges and law schools, and invariably a student will raise his or her hand and say, I was planning on going into public service, but I just can't do it now in this administration. And I will tell you, I then spend the balance of my time trying to talk that student into going. It might be a different answer, by the way, if I were talking about like a cabinet level position or something there, but where we're talking about someone entering into the career ranks of public service at the Department of Justice or other agencies, I tell them to go, and I'll try to be quick here about why. First, our career ranks are supposed to be made up of people from all across the political and ideological spectrum. That's what makes our government strong, is not that it's all a bunch of Democrats or a bunch of Republicans, but that we have people of differing views, and through the exchange of ideas, we make the best decisions with those differing views. You don't want to have a situation in which career people are hired in just on one end of the spectrum or the other. I also think that we all, at some point in our lives, have an obligation to do some kind of public service. And I'm not saying that everybody has to go work for the government, but I think all of us need to do something to make our country, our communities a better place, whether that's volunteering or in your job or in something. And then I also worry that if through this administration we turn off the spigot to bright, committed, dedicated people wanting to go into public service, that is an impact we are going to feel well beyond the confines of the Trump administration. So I guess my advice would be different from Director Clapper's, and that is I would tell them to go, depending on the job.
Got it. One of the things you spent so much time on in your tenure at the Justice Department was the perceived unfairness of some parts of the justice system, the notion that people were being sent to prison for too long for things that just didn't matter that much. We now have a much more punitive Attorney General and apparently Deputy Attorney General. Congress this week, on Wednesday, seems to be prepared to vote on a small portion of the ideas that you were espousing in terms of justice system reform. Where do you see the landscape now, federally and statewide?
Well, the good news, let's start with that first. The good news is, I think, that criminal justice reform, and when I say criminal justice reform, there are lots of different components to that. There's sentencing to ensure that sentences are fair and proportional to the crime that was committed, alternatives to incarceration, addressing mental health, prison reform, dealing with issues in reentry. I mean, there's a whole fines and fees and the criminalization of poverty. There's a whole range of issues in criminal justice reform. And the good news is that despite the position of the Attorney General on this issue, real criminal justice reform has taken root in states all across our country. In red states, in blue states, not every single component in every state, I'm not suggesting that, but you see it, 30-something plus states across our country have enacted some aspect of meaningful criminal justice reform. Now, they do it for different reasons. Some states, it's purely a fiscal thing. They recognize that even if we wanted to, we can't continue to incarcerate people at the levels that we are. Others approach it from a fairness perspective and recognize that the core component of our criminal justice system has to be fairness. Others, I mentioned earlier today, the governor of my state, a very conservative Republican, approaches criminal justice reform kind of from a Christian redemption standpoint, as a matter of faith, that he feels that he has that obligation. There are lots of different reasons that sort of are getting the states there, but they're there. And you see states like Texas, for example, usually not exactly the hotbed of liberal ideas there, but that they have been really very forward-leaning, both in sentencing reform and prison reform. There are closing prisons and investing the money into rehabilitation there. So I think that it's taking root there in the states. It would be ideal if there were leadership from the federal side, from the Department of Justice on this as well. But that is something that Attorney General Sessions he just doesn't believe in it. And I think he honestly believes that. He thinks that we should prosecute more people, we should send them to prison for longer, that's where we need to be spending our money. Not only do I worry about the fairness of that, I actually think that is going to make us less safe, not more safe. Because the bottom line is this is a zero-sum game. Any money that you spend prosecuting low-level, nonviolent drug offenders, for example, and sending them to prison for longer than they need to be there for public safety reasons, that's money you don't have then to be able to address more serious crimes. And so You may boost your numbers and you may be able to show, lots more people being prosecuted, but that's not what our goal should be. Our goal should be to make our communities as safe as possible. And that means prioritizing the use of our resources for those crimes and those individuals who really threaten it the most. So I'm hopeful on the state side. It's not going to have the same momentum without leadership on the federal side, but it's still taking root, I think.
One quick question, sideline from that. Yeah. You also spent a lot of your time on clemency issues, reviewing and approving petitions for clemency. Mm-hmm. The executive, the President of the United States, has enormous and even sweeping, maybe even unchecked power when it comes to pardons and clemency. This president has used his power so far to pardon people like Scooter Libby. How do you respond to that?
Look, I think I have tremendous admiration for President Obama and the work that he did in clemency, and that was to go back and try to address some of the inequities for individuals who were prosecuted under old laws and old penalties, where they got a lot more time for drug offenses, for nonviolent drug offenses, than they would get today. And so the goal of this was to try to go back and to adjust their sentences to make them more fair and more commensurate with what they would get today. That's a really good, productive use, I think, of the president's pardon authority. Scooter Libby, Sheriff Arpaio, as Sheriff Arpaio, as someone who was systematically violating the civil rights of Latinos and then violated a court order telling him not to do it anymore. That to me is a troubling use of the president's pardon authority.
Jennifer mentioned that fateful day in which you lost your job via email, or not via email, I guess.
Well, they tried to email me, but apparently it bounced back. What is that? I didn't have anything to do with that, so they hand-delivered a letter. Yeah.
But that was over the travel ban, and your belief that it was discriminatory on its face.
Yeah, that was a tricky situation there, and I'll try to sort of make a long story short, although it wasn't that long because it was only 72 hours from the time that I learned about the travel ban to when I needed to make the decision. It was Friday afternoon late, actually, after the president had already executed it, and it was then being publicly reported that we first learned of it then. And, we spent the weekend trying to sort of figure out what it was the administration was trying to accomplish here. This was back on Travel Ban 1. We're on 3.0 now, but this was the first one that actually applied to lawful permanent residents and to people with valid visas. So we had people who were literally in the air. They had gone on vacation and couldn't get back into the country. And the Travel Ban 3.0 does not apply to those individuals. But so we spent time trying to figure out what it was they were trying to accomplish, who they believed it applied to. We talked it through with the folks at DOJ, the Trump administration appointees, and the career people that would be responsible for defending this. And my conclusion was that it was neither lawful nor constitutional, that while on its face it purported to be based on national security, if it was based on national security, you would have thought they would have gone to the national security agencies or experts, and there was not only no consultation there, they weren't even advised of it. And beyond that, and looking at the president's statements about the intent to effectuate a Muslim ban that he made both during the time that he was on the campaign and after he was elected, I felt strongly that for the Department of Justice to defend this, we were going to have to go in and argue that this travel ban had absolutely nothing to do with religion. And based on the president's statements and other factors, I didn't believe that to be the truth, that DOJ would have to be advancing a pretext, and advancing a pretext on something that's about a core, fundamental, defining American value of religious freedom. And I don't think the Department of Justice should ever be doing that. And under those circumstances, that's why I directed the department not to defend it.
So fast forward a year, they're now on Travel Ban 3.0. The case has been argued by the Supreme Court. Most of the people who heard that oral argument think the court, a divided court, is actually going to rule in favor of the Trump administration. You talk about the importance of the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary. What will you do if the Supreme Court rules in favor of the Trump administration on travel?
Well, I don't have an official role of anything to do in it, but I think we accept the decision of the Supreme Court. That's the way our country works. Look, there are important differences between this travel ban beyond just the issue of lawful permanent residents and valid visa holders. There are important differences. They cleaned it up a lot from travel ban 1 to 3.0. My own personal view, though, is that this travel ban is infected with the same animus that infected the first one. But the way our country works, the way our system of checks and balances works, the way our democracy works is the Supreme Court makes that decision, and we all should abide by and live with that.
So you're not going to go to Twitter and talk about so-called justices or anything like that?
Now look, all of us can disagree. All of us have thought a judge got it wrong before. I mean, I was a prosecutor 27 years. I'm not going to tell you I didn't ever think a judge got it wrong, but there's something different in disagreeing with the decision of a court or a specific judge and undermining the very legitimacy of the system or that individual judge.
You also talk about the importance of a free press, something near and dear to my heart. This administration says it's continuing to review the policy under which reporters may be subpoenaed or their records may be subpoenaed. The president has called for more leak investigations. Attorney General Jeff Sessions says there are at least 27 active leak investigations. What's the risk that you see to the First Amendment and to the press, which has been assertive in chronicling the administration so far?
Yeah, I mean, look, all of us have probably disagreed with news reports in the past as well. I'm not suggesting to you otherwise there. But look, we all know, I mean, this is sort of basic government 101 here, how essential a free press is, both to informing the public so that we can all participate in our democracy and into holding our government accountable. And stories that we don't like or stories that an individual doesn't like, that doesn't make them fake news just because you don't like them. And I think that here, again, trying to undermine the very legitimacy of our press is the problem that I have with this. And, you know, after you repeat something enough, I think that it does have an impact on, again, the public's confidence in the news that they read and how they act then on that.
I remember running into you after the inauguration of the Justice Department, and it was shortly after the Sean Spicer press conference where the images were shown of the mall and whether the mall was full or not full, and whether it was more full than the Obama inauguration or less full than the Obama inauguration. And you were concerned then about misstatements. Well, last week, my former paper, The Washington Post, reported by its count, President Trump had lied 3,000 times in the last year. It's becoming normal. It's what you worried about.
Yeah, I mean, look, we can argue over policies, and we should argue over policies. That kind of debate is a good thing, but there's also such a thing as objective truth. And it matters, I think, whether people tell the truth and whether we hold people accountable for telling the truth. And, you know, that, I think the normalization of just being able to make it up as you go and there being no consequences, you know, I think that's a dangerous thing for us as well.
So what should people do about that?
Well, don't normalize it. And, you know, that sort of is easier said than done. And I get, you can't spend your whole day, you know, keeping up with the barrage of news and being outraged over every single story that comes across the wire there. You know, everybody's got their lives to lead. On the other hand, I do think that it's important that people plant a flag about who we are and what we stand for and what our values are and what is normal and what isn't. And some of the ways you do that are in simple conversations with family and friends and coworkers and others in terms of making sure we hold on to what makes us who we are. I actually still believe that our elected officials listen to that stuff, that when they hear from their constituents that they're troubled about things, that they listen. And then we can all vote. You know, that's the way that the people speak in a democracy. And we may not be able to control what our elected officials do, but we can control how we respond to it. And we can respond through voting.
I recently interviewed the former FBI director, Jim Comey, who has written a very successful, apparently, book called Higher Loyalty, which Mr. Axelrod has quipped should be called Higher Royalties, I think. Yeah. He's making a lot of dough off this book. Jim Comey asserts that he struggled greatly throughout 2016 about what to do, and he maintains that he did the right thing. Well, I know you don't want to talk about ongoing investigations or specifics, but traditionally in the Justice Department, the Deputy Attorney General is the one who supervises components like the DEA and the FBI. Looking back, would you have done things differently?
And that's one I'm not going to answer because there's an ongoing Inspector General investigation of Director Comey's actions with respect to the Clinton investigation. And while that's pending, I'm just not going to comment on it.
Can you talk a little bit about your response to his writing a book while an investigation is ongoing?
Look, everybody has to decide for him or herself what they think is appropriate to do there. Jim's obviously made his decision about what he thinks is appropriate.
But you've cooperated with the Inspector General, and presumably what you've had to say will be included in whatever report comes out this month.
Right, right.
I'm
just not going to give you more on this.
Well,
you know?
I have to tell you that I asked Comey if he had received a direct order from you or Attorney General Loretta Lynch, whether he would have talked so much in October. It might not have cured the problem in July, where he went out and said, I don't think we should charge Hillary Clinton, and she was extremely careless, and all these other words, which were responded to with great unrest by DOJ veterans. But Comey says in his book, and to me, that if he had received a direct order in October, he might not have sent various letters to Congress about the reopening of the investigation, which Hillary Clinton's team, at least some members of the team, believe may have cost her the election.
Wait for the IG report.
Okay.
And I get no royalties off of the IG report, I'll tell you.
You get my point, though.
I do.
You're the boss of him, or at least you used to be, whether you still are or not. I get this question all the time. I got this question on Twitter today when I mentioned we were going to be doing this event. People are super interested in what is next for you. A lot of people want you to run for public office. They have all these ideas about what you should be doing. What are your ideas about what you should be doing next?
Well, it's incredibly flattering that folks have mentioned to me that they would like for me to run for office. And look, it's clear I believe in public service. I wouldn't have stayed at the Department of Justice for 27 years if I didn't really believe in public service and feel a calling to that. But public service and running for office are not the same thing, and I've never felt drawn to running for office. And I've told folks before, I really do think that most people who do that have kind of always had that inside of them that they wanted to run. And I just don't feel that. I feel committed to the country and public service and that, but running for office is just not something that I can envision doing.
Your husband's been leaning on you to do this, though.
Well, he's leaned on me to at least keep the option open, so he keeps saying, just don't say never, you know, when people ask you that question. But that's something I have a hard, so, and you know, honey, I'm not saying never, but I don't foresee that happening.
So what are you going to do with all your time?
Well, actually, I've spent, what am I going to do with myself now? I've actually had a great year, you know, visiting at Georgetown. As you know, I've been at Georgetown Law School for the last year, and it's been fantastic. The students there are inspiring, just like, you know, students here are, and I'm confident I've learned more from them than they've learned from me. And I've really loved the speaking that I've been doing around at different places and talking about issues that I think are really important to our country. But I've also discovered something from this, and that is that I miss being a lawyer. That's, you know, I knew from the beginning of law school, I wasn't sure about going to law school, but I knew from the moment that I was there that this was the right thing for me, and I miss that. But at the same time, there are a number of public policy issues that I feel strongly about and want to be able to continue to have an impact on that. So marrying those two things. And want to get back to being a lawyer, but also have an opportunity to still work on things like criminal justice reform and democratic institutions and things like that.
We're going to open up to audience Q&A. A reminder, the first 3 questions to come from some of the many students in the audience.
Yep.
Don't be shy.
Hi, I'm Ben Kosvick. I'm a 3rd year. So first, Ms. Yates, I'd like to thank you for coming and talking to us. I know a lot of stuff has happened very recently with the Giuliani stuff that was very interesting to hear your perspective from. So my question, I know you talked a lot earlier about criminal justice reform, and you touched on this a little bit with your mention of Joe Arpaio, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on the status of police in America. I think it's fair to say that as those who are actually enforcing the laws, any true criminal justice reform needs to cover abuses of power by police. So my question has 2 parts. First, do you see anywhere in America where true police reform is happening? And second, do you think it's possible for a big city rife with police abuses of power, like New York or Chicago, to actually fix their police department? And what steps would have to be taken to make such changes permanent?
That's a really good question, Ben. Thank you for that. And that's actually obviously one of the most complex and important questions facing our criminal justice system today. And it's something that we spent a lot of time on in the Obama administration through the Civil Rights Division and U.S. Attorney's offices. And as you know, here in Chicago, with both of the 2 of them combined. And we had 2 different ways that we approached it in that administration, both through what we call pattern and practice investigations, where the Civil Rights Division would come in and do an investigation, and then we would have a consent decree that was signed by and enforced by a judge that laid out systemic changes that needed to be made in a police department to be able to address those issues. There's a whole separate type of reform that we were involved in that people don't know about as much, and that's what we call collaborative reform. And those are situations where police chiefs would raise their hand and say, we've got problems in our department, and I'm asking you, DOJ, to come in and help us. And we would bring experts from around the country, usually other police chiefs that had police departments that were working well, to come in and help them. One of the things that's troubling to me is that both of those have been shut down at DOJ now. And even the investigations that were done during the Obama administration, they haven't been able to provide the reports to the cities, even for collaborative reform, even where the police departments have raised their hands. And so I think we're going to have to grapple with this as a country. Look, I am a big supporter of law enforcement. I was a prosecutor for most of my professional life. I have tremendous respect. I think these are folks who put their lives on the line for us every day, and they deserve our respect. At the same time, there are not only individuals, but in some police departments, there are systemic issues and systemic abuses. And I'll tell you, the folks that I've seen over the course of my career that get most upset about that are the good cops. Good cops can't stand it when there's bad stuff going on in law enforcement agencies. And so I'm really hopeful that this Justice Department is going to rethink their approach and continue the reform that we were engaged in. Because while I think we made a lot of progress, I'm not going to tell you it was all fixed. There's still a lot more that needs to be done.
All right, thank you very much.
Sure.
Hi, Ms. Yates. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Andrew. I'm a 3rd-year undergraduate here in the college, and you spoke a little bit before about telling the folks at DOJ to, put your nose down and just be on the grind of what the important function of the day-to-day job of someone working in DOJ or another federal organization is. In a world where both we get constant CNN updates every 45 minutes telling us what's going on in the world, and then the hyper-polarized landscape that we find ourselves in, how do you have those conversations, and how do you think we continue to make sure that the institutions that are supposed to be fundamentally nonpartisan actually can operate to the best that happens?
Yeah, and that's the challenge that we're facing today. Look, I have confidence that there are a lot of career and political appointees at the Department of Justice that are really committed to doing things the right way. They might have instituted some policies I disagree with, like on criminal justice reform and other things, but that they are committed to the rule of law, to calling the facts in the law like they see it and applying it equally across the board. It's really hard to do that, though, in an environment where the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General seem to be like walked to the guillotine just about every other day and then walked back. That creates, obviously, a lot of tension. I'm not there now, so I can't tell you exactly what it feels like to be there. Certainly, talk with folks. And, they're working hard to try to make sure, regardless of all the noise and the swirl and the tweets and all of that stuff, that they continue to abide by their oaths and that they follow the facts and the law, and that's it. And, a lot of the folks are folks that I worked with for many, many years, and I have a lot of confidence in them.
Thanks.
Hello, thank you for coming to speak with us. My name is Valerie. I graduated in 2017 from the college.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I was thinking a bit more about the length of time that you spent at the DOJ and perhaps about the rarity of that, as many people sort of are graduating college and imagining switching careers many times over the course of their working life. I was hoping that you could comment a little bit on the reasons why you decided to stay for so long, and then perhaps by extension, where the distinction was made between sort of working behind the scenes and when you rose to a level of sort of control that was powerful enough to gain attention from the media, how that might have affected your opinion of the work.
Yeah. Well, I didn't intend to stay that long. I was at private practice at a law firm and had a really good experience there. And Judge Griffin Bell, who was the former Attorney General, who had come back to the law, I was at King & Spalding, had come back to the firm there, really encouraged me to go try the U.S. Attorney's Office. He said, go there and stay for a few years and then come back to the firm. And I went there, and 27 years later, I was still there. And I will confess to you, I was totally unprepared for how taken I would be by the mission of the Department of Justice. This sounds incredibly corny and hokey and all of that stuff, so just bear with me because I believe it. When you're part of DOJ, your only responsibility is to seek justice. That's it. It's not to get convictions, it's not to win trials, it's not to do anything else but to seek justice. If you're a lawyer, it doesn't get any better than that. And to feel like you're making a difference in the safety of your communities, to feel like you're trying to do the job in a way that engenders the confidence of the people that you're serving, how lucky was I? And I got to change, and so it wasn't like I was doing the exact same thing for all of those years. I was a line assistant and did a lot of public corruption cases, became chief of the public corruption section, supervised and continued doing corruption cases, then became first assistant, which is the highest career person in the office, actually under 2 Republican U.S. attorneys, and then was appointed by President Obama to be the U.S. Attorney in Atlanta, and then obviously the last 2 years as Deputy Attorney General, and for just a few days as Acting Attorney General. I'm the luckiest person in the world to have started as a line prosecutor at the Department of Justice and then be able to leave DOJ to end my service there as the number 2 person and an acting number 1 person there. I'm incredibly fortunate in that. And throughout it, I had different types of cases and different challenges that always kept it interesting and fresh. And I kept thinking, I know I'm supposed to leave here. I know I'm supposed to go do something else. But I couldn't think of why I would under those circumstances.
Last week, Judge Tillis in Virginia supposedly said that Paul Manafort's financial dealings should be beyond the reach of the special counsel. But I wonder, from your experience with public corruption and with the law of conspiracy, how you would tie financial ties together with collusion or a conspiracy of collusion. For example, one could say even when Trump selects someone who has a long history of financial ties with Russia, that might indicate some kind of intentionality. But how would you analyze that?
Well, let me speak first just generally into financial issues and corruption cases, and not speaking specifically about the Russia investigation or Paul Manafort. You know, that's sort of basic public corruption 101, is that you follow the money. You figure out what people's financial resources are, where money is coming from, what influences them. That's sort of basic core stuff in a corruption investigation. Now, I don't know the scope of the special counsel's mandate here, so I can't speak to whether that is within the scope or outside of that. If it's outside of it, that doesn't necessarily mean that he wouldn't get prosecuted. It just might mean that it then would go to the Department of Justice or to a U.S. Attorney's office to handle. So I don't know the specifics of that, but look, following the money is as I said, sort of 101 for corruption. Hi.
Thank you for coming. I'm Joe. I'm a second year in college.
Hi, Chad.
So kind of what I was thinking about and what I have a question about is what it was like for you to suddenly, after like leading a career in like very legal focused things, to be thrust into such a politicized spotlight. Like, was it really annoying for you to suddenly like be known and be known because of politics?
Yeah. You know, that's a really interesting question because, you know, I was a career person for the vast majority of my time at DOJ, and even after I was a political appointee, I think I still viewed my job through the lens of a career DOJ person, because that's really how you ought to be doing. I mean, DOJ is different than a lot of the other agencies. That's the reason why the White House is not supposed to have any involvement in any of the cases there, is that it's part of the executive branch, but it's supposed to be insulated from politics. So even when I was a political appointee, I didn't really view it that way. You know, after the fact, sure, some people have certainly ascribed political motivations or made assumptions about why I made the decision. I guess I'm very comfortable with knowing, I know why I made that decision, and I'm comfortable that that was the right thing for me to do, to be true to the law and to the Constitution, the principles of the Department of Justice. So I'm really at ease with that. It's a little weird now. Certainly, look, I did my job as DAG and nobody had a clue who I was. I mean, it's the #2 person at DOJ. Most people don't even know what the Deputy Attorney General is, much less who it is. And so it certainly was peculiar to go from virtual anonymity, which is just fine, to then all of a sudden being recognized a lot more. People have a lot stronger opinions about you. You know, that's kind of a weird thing. But I'll tell you, what really has been amazing through this is after I left DOJ, and I can say fired, it's okay, I've gotten through the therapy now and I can say it. I got these letters from people all over the country, some from outside of the country, and you gotta work to track me down because you know, the security detail had pretty much wiped the address off the internet. So they'd send them to my husband at his work, or to the state bar or my law school, or some of them to DOJ and ask them to forward them to me. And you know, some of them were incredibly kind thank you letters. Others are letters talking about what they're doing. You know, what they're doing to try to plant a flag and to make sure that we are defined in the way we should be as a country. And you know, is it strange to go to the gym and have somebody ask to take a selfie when I'm there with like dirty hair and no makeup and feeling very vain and really not wanting to do a selfie at that moment, but you do? Yeah, but on the other hand, you know, to be a part of something like that, it's an honor. So that was a much longer answer, I'm sorry, than I should have given to that.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Dylan. I'm a second year in the college. I just have sort of a similar related question. Obviously, the politicization of the DOJ and other departments, a large part of that has had to do with the media landscape, and when you have, you know, one network news channel relentlessly going after a department. I'm interested in sort of in what you think about that media dynamic and how we get back to a normal of an isolated branch of government that isn't affected by these political attacks with such frequency.
Yeah. Well, one thing we need to do is to get back to the norms that there is no involvement from the White House in criminal investigations or prosecutions at DOJ. And it's a norm, it's not a law, but since Watergate, it's a norm that has been honored by Democratic and Republican administrations alike, because there's a recognition for the rule of law to actually mean anything, then those decisions have to be made in isolation. I'm not talking about big, broad policy things. Certainly there could be discussion between the White House and DOJ on that. But specific cases and investigations, I think one of the first things that we have to do is to get back to that norm. And then, you know, all of us probably could do more to try to listen to news from other perspectives. To not just listen to one network or another or just get our news through social media. It can be annoying at times if you like hear stories that you just know are not accurate, but you know, we're a big country here and we need to be able to understand and appreciate what others think that are at a different point on the ideological spectrum, and to be able to also understand what news it is that they're hearing that's so different than what we might be hearing in ours. And then maybe if we can get to a point where, you know, it's not advocacy in the news from some, and we don't have that in a lot of media outlets, but we do in some, where it's not advocacy, but it really is reporting facts, and then letting all of us decide what our views are then.
Thank you.
Hi, Ms. Yates. Thank you for being here. My name is Caroline. I'm a fourth year in the college. My question is about, I know you mentioned the strength of our institutions and how one potential challenge moving into the future would be the dearth of public servants rising through the ranks, but in terms of longer lasting impact, what are the biggest, most dangerous precedents you think that Jeff Sessions leading the DOJ could be setting, and what work will have to be undone after the Trump administration, if any?
You know, I don't think I would lay this at Jeff Sessions' feet, because while I may disagree with him on a number of the policies, look, elections have consequences. You have to expect that there are going to be some policy changes. I disagree with a lot of those, but I don't see that as norm busting. What I see as norm busting is the attempted infiltration of the Justice Department by folks from the White House. And that, to me, is the more dangerous thing, because there's a question of just how elastic are we? You know, when this administration is over, whether it's, you know, the end of this one or another term, do we go back to the way things operated before in terms of the division between DOJ and the White House, or have the goalposts been moved now and this is the new normal? Policies can be changed and changed back and moved. And while real people are impacted by those policies, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that they're not serious and not consequential, but it's not norm busting to me in the way that interference and or attempted interference in the Department of Justice is.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Greer. I'm a second year in the college. Do you think it's an abuse of executive power for a president to fire, an attorney general for refusing to defend an executive order that appears to be unconstitutional? And if so, what do you think we can do going forward to prevent a president from such abuses of power, especially when he or she has a friendly majority in the House and Senate?
You talking about anything in particular here, or
just generally curious?
You know, I guess I'm more focused on the appropriateness of the president potentially firing Bob Mueller or Rod Rosenstein than I am trying to go back and parse my firing. That, to me, is what really is more consequential here for our country, and to ensure that we're able to really have a full and thorough investigation of Russian interference in our election. So that, to me, is where I think there should be serious consequences for trying to cut off that investigation.
Hi, I'm Michael Lynch, a second year of the college. Thank you for coming down today. I just wanted to ask, you talked earlier about how you didn't intend to go into the DOJ when you first became a lawyer. I was wondering what then made you decide that you wanted to be a lawyer before you went to law school?
It wasn't a terribly original career choice for me. Everybody in my family is a lawyer. From my father and both grandfathers and my cousins and my uncles. And even my grandmother, who actually was one of the earliest women admitted to the Georgia bar. But she didn't go to law school. This was back in the day when you could read law. And she read under another lawyer, took the bar exam. She was incredibly smart and passed. And there were no legal jobs. There were no lawyer jobs for lady lawyers, as they were called in the South back then. So she was a secretary for my father, my grandfather, and then later my father and my uncle. So I actually resisted the idea of going to law school initially because I kind of thought, God, I just really don't want to be a lawyer or around them, or just way too many of them. And so I resisted and lasted all of 2 years out of college before I then went to law school. And I think I mentioned earlier, I wasn't sure when I went to law school, but I was sure once I got there. It just made sense to me. It clicked. This was the way I thought. I liked the Socratic method. At the risk of losing all credibility with you, I liked law school. That's when I knew I'd made the right choice. So not a terribly original decision on my part, but it worked out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. I wonder what you think the fallout would be if Trump were to issue a blanket pardon to everybody involved in this affair. It seems to me that's neither a high crime nor misdemeanor, so it's not an impeachable offense. And since it's a legitimate power, I doubt that he could be indicted for that, and there's a serious question about whether the sitting president can be indicted anyway. So I wonder what you think the fallout would be if he did something like that.
Wow. What do you think the fallout would be? And I'm not just dodging the question. I'm interested in from a real person's perspective. What do you think?
I've only been practicing law for 47 years, so I think he gets away with the whole thing if he does it.
Really? I don't know. I want to hope not.
He may not be elected to a second term. That's a different question.
Yeah, I guess you've heard a number of people in Congress on both sides of the aisle say that firing Bob Mueller would be the line, that you can't cross that line. I would hope that they would see issuing blanket pardons that ostensibly were done for the same purpose, to end the investigation. Mm-hmm. I would hope that they would have the same reaction to that, and that they would see that, again, in a rule of law country, no one is above the law, and we need to get to the bottom of this Russia thing.
So we have a constitutional crisis, and the Supreme Court has to decide. Is that where you're coming down?
I don't, I guess I hope that maybe there's a deterrent effect from people signaling to him that that's a step too far, and that that's not a politically viable option for you, and that he wouldn't do it. Maybe that's a Pollyannish thing, but I would hope that would be the case.
Thank you very much.
And thank you so much to the Institute of Politics, the university, Mr. Axelrod, and thank you to, we do have one more. Okay, sorry.
But thank you anyway.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. And not to sound Pollyannish, but I'm really inspired by the fact that you stood up for your values and your defense of the rule of law, making the choice that you did. I'm a teacher, and I'm always talking to students about what does it mean to stand up and have a voice, and to challenge authority when there's a basis for it. So my question for you, I'm struck by the idea of thinking about the travel ban and standing by, obviously, whatever the Supreme Court determines in their ruling. But I guess my question to you is, you charge us with sort of taking a role as individuals in defending democracy, and I'm wondering about this idea of interpret the law, obviously, highest minds, but what would you say then is the role of individuals? You accept the decision, but there's obviously there's going to be differing interpretations. So as citizens, what would be the role that one could take to give voice to perhaps a distinction in interpretation, and what's your sort of take on the politicization of the Supreme Court given the way people have been nominated? I mean, that's not a very clear question, I guess.
No, that's well, there's a lot in there. I guess sort of when you talk about politicization, look, I think one of the great injustices was that Merrick Garland didn't even get a hearing for the Supreme Court. A great injustice, and he would have been a terrific justice on the court. The Supreme Court, when it makes decisions in some matters, it's not always just a matter of black letter law. I mean, if you think back to the marriage equality case, part of the basis for that decision is where we are as a society right now. And I think that the court takes the temperature of our country and where we are, particularly some social issues like that. And so I think it's important that they know where we are and what we believe in. And so I think you can, obviously you can't, it doesn't change a statute when you do that, but it can change how the court interprets it. Some might call that politicization. Others might call that the court being a reflection of the people of the country. I'm not real sure about that, but I know that there's, sometimes it's more art than science.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Stephen. I'm a graduate student at the Harris School of Public Policy, and I have a follow-up question to something you mentioned earlier about being a woman who decided to pursue a law degree. One could argue that decisions made in a room full of white men might not be the most inclusive or representative. So what more do you think could be done in government and in politics to be more inclusive to underrepresented minorities?
Oh, look, I think, that's one of the most important things that we should be doing, not just, for a couple of reasons. One, from a fairness perspective, so that everybody has equal opportunity, but also, again, we make the best decisions when we're able to get diverse perspectives. And so I think it really is important that we be looking at that from all avenues of gender and race and background and socioeconomic status. Those are all things that sort of provide the fabric of our country and that make us the strong place that we are. So, I think certainly people being conscious of that and acting intentionally to have a more diverse workforce and to have people in positions of authority be diverse and more reflective of our entire society is essential.
And this is going to be our last question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Matthew. I'm also a graduate student at the Harris School of Public Policy. And I guess my question is, as a student at the Harris School, we work a lot on the quantitative elements, the analysis side of things. But I know, for example, recently with the gerrymandering case before the Supreme Court, there's discussion about being allergic to math and this fear that you can make any kind of a metric say any story you want to say. But of course, we're in an increasingly data-driven world. So I'm curious your thoughts going forward in terms of justice and law. How do we balance the need for analytical thinking and the quantitative reasoning, but not necessarily worrying too much about sociological gobbledygook and some of those implications?
Wow, that's a heck of a question to end on there. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how the Supreme Court comes out in this case, where I know one of the issues that they struggled with in the prior gerrymandering case is like, well, how do we decide this? How much is too much? And in this argument, they actually gave them data that they could use to be able to see very intentional acts that were done that would be inconsistent with our Constitution. And so, I think the Supreme Court moves with the times as well, maybe sometimes not as quickly as 20-year-olds do, but I think they move with it. And so I think it's going to have to adapt more to whether it's data or technology or other issues. It's got to adapt to it more. And looking to past decisions when we did not have access to that information is not always going to be fully instructive to where we are right now. So I'm sorry that I'm not sure that completely answers your question. But great, thank you.
And thank you so much, Sally Yates.
Thank you all. This has been a treat. Thank you, Carrie.